Welcome everybody to episode 13 of Black, Brown, Yellow, White. And I'm very happy today to have Professor Russell Jeung from the San Francisco State University. He is a professor of Asian American Studies and he specializes in the sociology of religion, the sociology of race, and social movements. He is a co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, a national coalition in the USA addressing anti-Asian American hate and racism also against Pacific Islanders. Named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in 2021, Jung's work has been featured in the New York Times, PBS NewsHour, and Oprah Daily. His research and advocacy focuses on the experiences of Asian American communities and combating discrimination. So thank you very much for having you here today.
Thanks for inviting me, Temba.
So at the beginning, we usually like to get a little picture, a small biopic, 90 seconds, 120 seconds of our interviewee, our main protagonist. So how have you, Professor Jeung, arrived at this point in time?
Well, I'm a fifth generation Chinese American, meaning my grandparents came from China to California in the mid 19th century.
Yeah.
And every generation, however, experienced rampant racism. They faced mass dispossession, mass detention, mass deportation, segregation. And so knowing my family's history, I grew up, even though we've been in the US so long, and people usually think that Asian Americans then could assimilate and move into middle-class suburbs, we stayed in Chinese communities. And I always wondered why, if I speak English well and if my family is educated in professional class now, why am I still living within Chinese communities in the United States? And so that was what I explored, my own sort of status as a racialized American who also noticed a lot of the contradictions in the US about the poverty, the lack of opportunity for immigrants and communities of color. And so that's been a driving force.
And we'll shortly return to all these different and complex questions of community and racism. But at the beginning, I would also like to ask you maybe about some of the sources of your inspiration. It could be historical figures, people in your life, works of art. What has given you some input, some motivation, some inspiration?
When I was growing up in the 1960s and 1970s, there was a lot of activism in San Francisco and the United States overall. And at San Francisco State, where I now teach, students went on the longest strike for ethnic studies, and they were able to succeed and win the College of Ethnic Studies. So those students were my models of making social change. The professors came out of the community and really worked to improve the community. And another key movement then, about a decade later, was this fight in San Francisco to preserve the housing for elderly. And that building was slated to be a parking lot, and the elders were evicted. But the community really stood up and fought against the eviction. They created a human barricade to protect the elders. And I was really moved by that struggle about, again, the exploitation and unfairness of capitalism driving out poor elders.
Okay. Were there also some people in your immediate social sphere that kind of were particularly influential?
So I think I met a lot of young activists who are sort of community leaders, are not well-named, popular or famous people. So I'm actually model myself more after those people who work in the grassroots level. My sister was like a model. Even while I was in high school, she was engaged in a community affairs radio program.
Yeah.
But yeah, my models weren't famous people. They were actually just people working at the grassroots, wanting to make change by organizing people.
Okay. Um, do you remember, was there some kind of specific moment or a turning point, or maybe it was a more gradual process that got you interested in the beginning in Asian American studies?
Hmm. I got interested in Asian American studies because I took a class in high school. We actually had ethnic studies in high school. And that again helped me become aware of a lot of the contradictions in society. At the same time, I was taking this class, I had an internship at the Pacific Stock Exchange.
Mm-hmm.
And there I saw a lot of white professionals, men, making millions of dollars simply
Yeah.
by shuffling paper around. And so while they were doing the stock exchanges, I saw people of color working around them doing a lot of the manual labor.
Yeah.
I was really struck by that difference, the ease at which white men could make money and how hard people of color had to work just to survive. And that made an impact on me and thought, this isn't right. And I actually thought, I don't want to spend my life just making money that seems so meaningless, in this way. And so even then, in high school, I thought um, something's not right about our society.
Thanks for this concise and vivid account of your background. Now, I would jump right into the heart of the matter, and as a very first question, very blunt, what is your understanding basically of racism, and where do you see its causes and some of its effects in today's society?
Mm. So for me, racism is a long historic process of dividing people based on physical features like skin color and hair, but it's a system. It's institutionalized. It's an ideology that justifies the exploitation and oppression of different groups.
Mm.
And with the start of slavery, Europeans need to justify why they were enslaving Africans, and they would again differentiate themselves from Black people by saying Blacks were inferior and deserved to be slaves. They needed to justify stealing the lands of indigenous people. So they, again, distinguished and differentiated themselves from indigenous people and said, these people are uncivilized and we have the right to discovery and to take over their lands. So I see racism as connected to, inherently connected to inequitable systems, economic systems like capitalism, and
Yeah.
used as a justification for that unequal treatment. And then over time, as they justify that unequal treatment gets institutionalized in policies and laws and practices and in people's language and discourses.
Yeah.
So that institutionalization then perpetuates the initial justification of unequal treatment, and it just becomes embedded in our society. So in the US, again, laws taking indigenous land, laws making Africans 3/5 human and not counting them as fully human, all are embedded in our society and shape how we think even today. For
Mm.
Asians, we were always seen as the opposite of the West.
Yeah.
And that's the idea of Orientalism. Asians and especially Middle Eastern people were identified as opposite the West. And since we're exotically different from the West, it's like the East is East, the West is West.
Yeah.
We from the East were seen as inferior, we're seen as exotic and foreign. And so our difference then really helped the West define itself. So
Mhm.
whereas the East was the East was represented as being superstitious and heathen, the West was seen as rational and scientific. the West was seen as Christian and civilized, whereas
Yeah.
the East was seen as traditional. We always see pictures of old China as being a historic um, civilization. The West is seen as progressive and modern. And
Yeah.
so for me, even growing up, I saw the American part of me being very normal,
Hmm.
whereas the Asian side of me was sort of weird and different. And so that type of thinking that Asians were inferior and foreign to the West shaped my consciousness. But I think it also shaped current racism because now when Asians come to the US, they're seen again as outsiders who don't belong and they get treated as such.
Yeah. Um, but what you just said about how it changed your mind, it immediately made me think of this phrase, which is stuck in my head. I'm not sure, still not sure what to think about it, but decolonize your
Mhm,
mind. Does it
mhm.
speak to you and how?
Yeah, because people of color, we also adopt this thinking and this ideology and this discourse, right? So, for example, um, in the movies from Hollywood, there used to be a villain named Fu Manchu, who was like the
Mhm.
arch nemesis of the West. He was a Chinese person hell bent on world domination, right?
Yeah.
And so he was this evil looking person with a dripping mustache and long nails. And he was a drug lord. He engaged in the prostitution of white women as sex slaves, and he wanted to conquer the world. And
Yeah.
then my grandfather actually moved from Oakland to Hollywood to work
Hmm.
in the movies. And we only had two pictures of him, photographs. And so I
Yeah.
never met him, but the way I imagined my grandfather was from that photograph where he was Fu Manchu. So
Um,
I thought, based on Hollywood representations, that my grandfather was this evil criminal, like,
yeah.
and so that's how Hollywood shapes our consciousness. It shapes our own internal racism. But years later, when I looked at the photo, I found it. He wasn't dressed like Fu Manchu. He didn't, but he was just another ancient Chinese-looking guy.
Yeah.
But but it shows to me how our own thinking gets shaped by popular representations and stereotypes, and then we sort of impose that or adopt that for ourselves. So we have this discourse of Orientalism of how Asians are represented. And then let's say I'm a writer and I want to write to Western audiences. I'm in the United States. I could write about the Asian experience, but I write it for a Western audience, right? In order to
Yeah.
sell money, in order to make um, sales. I would then self-orientalize possibly just so that I could sell books, right?
Yeah.
I maybe depict my family as being more exotic than it is. I may talk about like pandas and I don't know, Chinesey things, and
Yeah.
that's what the West expects me to be like. And so I then self-orientalize. So I can adopt this type of thinking just because that's how the system, that's how audiences are all sort of willing to accept about being Chinese.
Yeah. And maybe elaborating a bit in this direction, could you also talk a bit on the specificity of this API hate? Because we have the term racism, Islamophobia, but API hate is also a bit also a different category again.
Yeah, it is. So yeah, like Islamophobia, I think has been racialized that anybody who looks Muslim, maybe having the same skin color, maybe wearing head coverings, then they'll get racialized. Oh, they must be Muslim, so they must be a terrorist. And
Mm,
that's the type of thinking for Islamophobia. For anti-Asian hate, especially during COVID-19, during the pandemic, if you're wearing a mask and if you look Chinese, then people will automatically think, oh, you might be a diseased person. You're an outsider who's bringing in a pandemic. And so the anti-Asian hate during the pandemic was especially oriented towards um, Chinese people who are seen as the yellow peril.
mhm.
So the yellow peril is a stereotype that yellow people are perilous or dangerous, that we from Asia and the Middle East are a threat to the West and to, America's existential livelihood.
Yeah.
The fear is that because there's so many Asians and we're such a large group, that we would come over in hordes and take over the United States. We could take over with our diseases. We could steal jobs. We could. We're national security threats because our technology is superior. So there's a great fear of Asians in America's subconscious, and I think anti-Asian hate, especially directed towards Chinese, is a reflection of that yellow peril stereotype.
Yeah. You have founded, or you have been one of the co-founders of Stop AAPI Hate. Generally speaking, in the USA, what needs to be done? What needs to happen more?
Yeah, well, again, as I said, because of this yellow peril stereotype, over half of Asian Americans, even now after COVID is no longer that dominant, over half of Asian Americans still experience hate incidences. And we still live in fear, and feel unsafe. Over half of us still feel like we don't belong or are accepted in the United States. So even though a lot of Asian Americans have are professionals, entered corporate worlds, are educated, they still experience racism. Again, and I think primarily because we're seen as outsiders who don't belong. We're seen as the yellow peril. So this is a strong, deep-rooted ideology, and I think what needs to be done is we have to uproot this type of thinking that Asians are outsiders, that Asians are not human, that Asians are different and a threat. And the way you change people's thinking isn't to try to go to the opposite and demand that Asians belong, or demand that Asians are just like everyone else, or Asians are good Americans. I don't think that that's the type of thinking that needs to change. But actually, I think the United States needs to change its thinking from an insider-outsider perspective to saying, oh, these people are outside and while we belong. I think America needs to change its thinking about who belongs, how welcoming it is, and who is really human and their neighbor, versus thinking Asians are good Americans. Because, I don't even want to belong to the America necessarily. I don't want to fight for belonging. I don't want to deserve to belong. I think that's really dangerous, because now the rhetoric is, in order to belong in the United States, you have to be a good immigrant, right? You have to be useful to the economy. If you're not, then you're illegal. And that just treats humans as a commodity. It treats humans based on their function, not on their being human, as being a child of God, or being their neighbor or your family. You think of people as an outsider. And so I think that's the type of thinking that needs to change, is instead of thinking people as commodities and thinking of relationships as transactions, we need to think of people as people.
Thank you for stating that so clearly. Now, in your articles, I came across the expression racial justice a few times, and I realized that for me, I don't know, as maybe being a bit naive from Switzerland, that I struggle a bit with the term, because the racial, kind of seems to imply that something like race exists. So how do you see the importance and relevance and meaning of racial justice?
That's a great question. I'll take both concepts individually. So in terms of race, it's not a biological existence, right? There's no fact or truth that we're different racially. But we are treated differently by
Mhm.
our physical features. And in that way, race does exist in terms of its effect. That race does have consequences on our lived experiences. It has consequences on our life opportunities. It has consequences on how long people live, right? Our
Yeah.
health and well-being is based on our race. So race is not a real construct in that it biologically creates difference, but race is a sociological concept that has real life consequences.
No.
And if we ignore it and try to be colorblind, then these racial difference, these effects will continue and actually get magnified because we're ignoring the differences. So we need to be conscious, color conscious, rather than being colorblind to deal with race. If we want
Yeah.
to get rid of this unequal treatment, we have to be conscious of it, see where it exists, and uproot it.
Yeah.
So race, we have to be aware of the racial effects of how we're racialized in order to address inequality.
No.
Now, justice is often seen in a Western sense. In the United States, we're really concerned about our rights. And so injustice is when our rights are taken away. And so we need to defend our rights. Like if someone steals something from us, that's our rights being impinged upon. And then in defense of our rights, we then punish others who take our rights, right? So in the US, justice is seen as defending our rights and punishing people, punitive justice, in order to make things right again. But for me, I have a different Asian sense of justice. And this is really different. Instead of thinking about individual rights, that everybody has rights and no one can take our rights, I think in the Asian sense, we're a collective and everybody in this collective has responsibilities.
Yeah.
And we're all to assume our duty and our obligation to care for one another, to make sure that everybody's fed, to make sure that everybody is housed, to make sure everybody gets educated.
Mm-hmm.
And injustice occurs when people don't live up to their responsibility. So when we fail in our corporate responsibility, then people are unhoused, people drop out of school, people have to resort to crime. And so for me, injustice is when people aren't responsible to each other and take care of each other. And so it's a collective sense. It's one about taking our responsibilities. It's more of a societal sense of justice, right?
Yeah.
Racial justice then is when we're responsible to each other, taking care of each other and addressing racial differences that create harm. And if we see our brother or sister harmed because of race, then it's our responsibility in solidarity to support them. So if I see Black people being shot by police, it's my responsibility to stand up for them, right?
Yeah.
And that's justice. If I see water rights of indigenous people being stolen, it's my responsibility to say that's wrong. So for me, racial justice is taking responsibility over injustices that occur by race. That's
Thank
a
you.
different sense, right? It's a different Asian sense of thinking, of being more collectively oriented, more feeling that we're interdependent rather than thinking individualistically. That's what we do in the United States.
Yeah. Thank you for putting it so clearly. It also has echoes for me a bit of some of the earlier interviews where some of the interviewees mentioned Ubuntu. And I mean, really, if you
Exactly.
look into the
Uh-huh.
details, there will be many differences, but there's a similarity of
Yeah,
spirit.
it's a collective interdependent notion that we're all in this together.
Hmm. So there's this force field of racism, anti-racism, and as another term, or not just a term, but as another aspect of human collectivity and our everyday life, I would like to look at with you is your understanding of diversity and some of your earliest encounters with diversity.
So That's a good question. I think, growing up as an Asian and Chinese person in the United States, I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood that later on, as immigrants moved in, became more Asian. But early on, like my first days of school at the playground, I remember an incident where some kid asked me, "Are you a chink or a Jap?" and had, used slurs against me. And I don't
Yeah.
remember that much about my childhood, but that was one of my strongest memories of being
Yeah.
name called. And so I thought, for me, diversity is, first of all, being marked, it's that we're different and we're treated differently, right? Just by the way we look. And so that's my first thought about diversity. But as I explore diversity and as I think about my own, again, as I thought a lot about being Chinese in the United States, I really recognized the difference between the value systems of being Chinese versus being, let's say, mainstream American. I mentioned already having an interdependent collective orientation versus a very individualistic orientation. I contrasted being seen as normal versus being seen as foreign and exotic. But I think another difference is us trying to defend your rights versus learning to assume responsibility, which is, I don't know why I'm having such a strong sense of responsibility, but it could come from my Chinese background, right? That I saw people all around me taking on responsibilities and working hard, not for themselves, but taking care of others.
Mm.
So for me, diversity, cultural diversity, means that there are differences from different cultures in what they value in their practices and how they think. And I think I learn a lot from that and I grow from it. And I really appreciate it. I just love being in different cultures when they do things differently. And when I see cultural differences and learn from cultural differences, and then when I get accepted by other different cultural groups, then I have this strong sense of welcome and belonging. And I love that. I love being able to enter a group and then have them treat me well with hospitality.
Yeah.
And so since I love that welcome so much, when I go into different contexts and people treat me um, kindly and nicely, share food with me, um, and treat me as a family, that's, for me, that sense of belonging is a great feeling, right? And
Yeah.
so you could feel different, yet feel really at home and having that sense of belonging. And so that's what I think the United States should be. We're all different. We recognize that we all have our different cultures and backgrounds, but we can welcome each other um, and give each other that sense of belonging. And racism doesn't do that. Xenophobia treats people as outsiders, doesn't issue that belonging. Whereas the value of diversity means we know you're different, but we still treat you like our family and we invite you into our culture. And that's a great experience.
Mm. Um, so you've given us your understanding and some of these positive aspects. Do you think there can be instances where diversity can in any way become problematic, or would you say it's mostly has all, these positive aspects of cultural enrichment, etc.?
Yeah, let me first talk about one positive that I thought about diversity at the workplace. So in the United States, usually the communication style, the leadership style, the management style that's actually given privilege and advantage would be a dominant white male form of leadership and communication where they
Yeah.
speak out, they're assertive, maybe they're stand out. And that then signals that confidence signals capability and strength.
Yeah.
And so, but that's a narrow view of leadership. And you recognize that type of person may be good in being outspoken, but they not know what they speak about, right? They may appear confident and capable, but they're just sort of talking just because they like to talk.
Yeah.
And people maybe who are more quiet, maybe even more intelligent, maybe even more innovative, but they're just more quiet, and so they're not given as much opportunity. So, but if you embrace that diversity, you would give leadership not only to the outspoken person, but to the more quiet person who has other traits. Or another person may be very emotionally intelligent, understand the feelings of the group, and then address the feelings of the group in order to make them work better together and work harder, right? So that person isn't seen as the typical leader, but they have leadership in other areas. And that's where diversity is productive, is that if you have different perspectives, one who's really outspoken, one who's really innovative, one who's really emotionally intelligent, that helps a group become a better unit. And in that way, recognizing that we all have diverse strengths and then helping people develop those strengths is the power of diversity. Diversity, that's sort of a unique individual strength. Diversity can become problematic when the value systems are really sort of oppositional. And so people feel like, oh, you need to be outspoken. And other people think, oh, you speak too much. And then you clash over those differences. Diversity can be problematic when people think the way I do things is right and true. Let's say by some religious groups, and other groups say, no, but my beliefs are right and true, right? So religious diversity is really problematic. And so my observation about American politics now is that it's become very polarized because our politics have taken on religious tones, so that Republicans think our political beliefs are sacred. The right of every unborn child to live is sacred. And then on the other side, the Democrats will say, no, the right for the woman's defense of her own body, that's sacred. And so because we think now in these sort of strongly held beliefs, that polarization gets more extreme. And so then we, instead of being able to work together, we sort of attack each other over our sacred beliefs. And that's a real problem of diversity, is everything is getting politicized. So wearing a mask, is that right? It becomes a right or wrong thing to do, right? During the COVID. Or what gets taught in schools. Everything gets politicized, and then it takes on religious tones. Well, that's sacred to me, and I got to defend it at all costs. And then we can't compromise, and we can't work together. But so our diversity now is the source of our division, and that division leads to demagoguery, or it leads to a government system that's at a standstill because we can't make decisions.
Thank you for making that illuminating link between diversity and the political landscape, fractured polarized political landscape in the US today. At this point, I usually move on to a third area of interest, which is agency, but I think it's a bit sterile, a bit too abstract, and I would like to break it down to, I think, something that might be somewhat closer to your issues and fortes, and that is activism. So my question would be related to activism. Where do you see that, or what were your earliest experiences with activism, and how has this activism influenced both your thinking and your emotions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as I said, when I was in high school, my sister was involved with a community radio program to bring awareness of issues in the community. That's when the International Hotel, where the elderly were being housed, got evicted. And so that was my earliest memories and forms of activism, where we went on the radio to let people know of what's happening in the community. And it was done in an entertaining, fun way. It was a big, popular radio station, but a short show. But I realized that raising awareness of issues, trying to do it in an entertaining way that's fun, was just a great experience for me. And so I got more aware of what's happening in low-income neighborhoods as a result of what's happening in communities of color that were being marginalized. And then later on, after college, I worked for the mayor in San Francisco, and he had that office had a lot of power, and so if I called any department, I could get something done, right? Because he's the leader and the head of the department. I go, wow, I have so much power. I could just make phone calls and things happen. And so that really gave me a sense of effectiveness, of efficaciousness. So that if I take action, things will get done, which is really different, because all my life I grew up like feeling powerless and feeling like this, person who was sort of more quiet or afraid of people. But after working in the mayor's office, I go, wow, if I just talk to people, people actually take action. And I realized if we all speak for others and give other people voice, then they could just call out what needs to be done and things can change. So for me, activism involves becoming aware of issues and recognizing inequalities. That's the first step that I learned in high school. And then the second step was realizing it's not just individuals who are affected by an issue, but a whole group, right? That we have grouped inequalities. So it's not just me as a Chinese person being mistreated. A lot of Chinese people are getting mistreated. So we have a linked fate, we have a solidarity. So the second step is recognizing our group solidarity, or me as a working class person has the same issues as this other working person. And then the third step is feeling like if we assert our rights, we can have a sense of efficacy, that we can actually make a difference. So in social movements, we talk about having those three steps of awakening people's consciousness, of being aware of an inequality, recognizing group solidarity, and a sense of group efficacy. Then you could actually get people to act together to make a change. That's what I use for Stop AAPI Hate in that movement. That's what I teach my students. If you want to make change, take those three steps, and they're not like always the perfect recipe, but we know that they're necessary steps to make a movement grow.
And has there also been maybe any kind of specific, I don't know how to put it, the emotional impact for you?
Yeah, I think at each step, right? I talked about three steps. I think at each step, it's sort of there's an emotional connection. So let's say you become aware of inequality and you realize it's not, people aren't attacking me because there's something wrong with me, but it's because of racism and the system. For me, that gives people an aha moment, right? It's like, I'm not to blame for how my mistreatment, but it's like people hate me and that's their problem, not my problem, right? So I think that awareness leads to aha moments that I think are powerful. I think, and then the second step of having a group solidarity, like it's not just me who's to be blamed, but other people are getting mistreatment. That sense of solidarity, that gives you a sense of belonging that I told you that I love so much. That sense of belonging and kinship, that sense of I may be suffering, but at least we're in it together, that I'm not alone. That's powerful. And the third step, that sense of efficacy, that if I stand up and we stand up together for our rights, that gives me a sense of power. That gives me a sense of joy, that together we can make a difference. That,
Yeah.
you know, one example is like we have where near in my neighborhood, a lot of people dump, and our waterways are really dirty. But
Yeah.
on certain days, we all go out and clean up, and you could see the difference. Like this trashed, ugly place suddenly becomes pristine and beautiful nature again. And
Mm.
that's such a good feeling of accomplishment, a good feeling of working hard together, the good feeling of being one with nature. So
Mm.
for me, that's why I've given my life to this type of calling, because the aha moments, the sense of belonging, the power of making a difference, all are meaningful for me.
Mm.
I hope that inspires other people to get involved. I don't know how to express it better, but
Mm.
I think it's so much more meaningful to be engaged in trying to make this world better than just seeking our own consumption. That's what I try to teach my students. I think um, in our current climate crisis, that unless we learn to work together instead of fighting to maintain our own individual ways of life, that's extractive, that's necessary. And so, unless we adopt a more interdependent activist mindset, you know, the world's going to burn, and we're going to leave it to our children and grandchildren a lot worse.
Mm. Um, in this last part, when you were talking a bit about our holistic responsibilities, and maybe also the sense that hopefully you can, I'm sure you can inspire other people. I was thinking about the last part I had in mind in this complex of questions, which is that from my research, you follow the teachings of Christ. You're a Christian, and I was thinking for you, what role does faith take in this fight against discrimination?
Yeah. So again, my faith gives me motivation and strength to carry out this work. Um, you know, I talked early on about how I thought about how the United States is such a land of contradiction, that it's not right, right?
Mhm.
That we're not treating other people rightly. And that came from my faith, where we're supposed to seek the kingdom of God first and God's righteousness. And that's not just righteousness in terms of God, but we are supposed to seek God's right ways with each other. We're supposed to seek first God's right ways with nature and the environment. And so, again, my activism is formed by my faith, where I think in terms of what's right and wrong. I
Mm.
think my faith informs me in giving me hope and endurance, that, you know, you could see how our systems and our institutions, especially our economic system, again, are oppressive and exploitive, and that we're all complicit in it, right? So that as much as I want to live simply, I still buy products that are made by labor that aren't paid well, that that I still eat foods that are grown and use up the soil. So I'm sort of, or I live in a nation that elects someone who wants to mass deport people. So I'm sort
Yeah.
of stuck in this system, and I feel complicit in it, right? I feel
Mm.
guilty for having so much privilege when I know people are refugees and stuck in camps, and I have housing, right? And so I'm sort of torn with my complicity, but my faith then gives me hope that we can change this system, not just help individuals, we can actually change the system, and
Mm.
that things will get better rather than things will continue to exploit, and the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That my faith helps me, I think, differently.
Mm. So there is an important element or aspect of hope and believing in better outcomes. In the next question, I would like to tie it in a very basic, naive way a bit back to your work in the sciences. And the question is, in this series, we focus on racism and diversity. Maybe you could talk about how sociology and social sciences inform your understandings and actions towards discrimination, racism, these kinds of things.
Yeah, I think my academic training and my research informs how I analyze society, how I see races being treated differently by understanding how institutions such as the government, such as corporations, such as police, such as the educational system, how these institutions perpetuate practices that create inequality.
Yeah.
My research also informs me how people's religious thinking shapes their ideologies, how their religious teachings and traditions affect their actions, and then affect how they treat people racially, right? And so if you combine how people's spirituality and religious natures affect their thinking, if you look at how institutions and society shapes people's thinking, that all intersects on how people think about different racial groups and how racial groups are treated differently. So I think my academic research informs me on how people are interdependent and how people's thinking impacts our treatment of each other. And the question then is like, why do people think in certain ways? Why do different cultures think differently? Why do people have different ideologies about how we should treat each other? And those are big picture questions that help me explain inequalities and different treatment by race. And having that big picture understanding then, again, helps me understand how do we then change these systems of racial differences? How do we change systems that exploit?
And given your status as social scientist and as a man of color, of Chinese heritage, in the academic environment of the US, what have been your encounters or experiences or confrontations with discrimination?
So I created Stop AAPI Hate. It was this online reporting center where people could share their own experiences of discrimination during COVID-19. I helped co-founded it because I, again, was aware of the history of how Asians were treated during pandemics. So this wasn't the first time that Asians were scapegoated and blamed for a disease. It happened when the bubonic plague came in 1900. It happened during SARS in 2003. So when I first learned about COVID coming from China, I was just really worried about it because it was a dangerous disease killing people, but it was also spreading quickly across borders. And so when it came to the United States, I just paid attention to news accounts of people being treated differently. One stark story was a man in Australia had a heart attack, but nobody wanted to help him because they thought he had COVID. And so he died. And I go, that's wrong. That again, it's injustice because people weren't taking the responsibility to care for each other. So I worked with community groups here, and we asked the state government, this is increasing. You could see the stark difference in news account numbers. So start collecting data on it so that we could address it. And when the government didn't take action, we created our own website and started collecting data ourselves. So that's to raise the awareness of the issue. And immediately we got hundreds of reports. And so we created Stop AAPI Hate to collect the data and then to document the problem, highlight it, to make government accountable. And I think that's my role as a social scientist, to gather data and information, to tell a story, and then to influence and inform both policymakers and the media about what's happening. And I think that was pretty effective, so that when people saw in the news an elderly person being shoved, we realized this isn't just an individual isolated case. This is happening all across the nation. This is happening all across the world. And so this is a serious issue that we need to address. And so that's how I thought of my role as a social scientist, to raise awareness and address the issue, and then provide an analysis that's not just, oh yeah, Donald Trump's just evil, but instead to say, no, this is an example of institutional racism, where the political rhetoric is fomenting racism against an entire group.
Yeah. Now, in an earlier interview, I talked to Swiss playwright Fatima Mouni, and she had many different experiences with racism here in Switzerland, and she became, among other things, she was also a spoken word artist, a rapper, etc. But among other things, she became this expert on issues of anti-racism and racism, and she did many workshops, and was confronted with these different topics of racism again and again. And she said at one time she had the feeling that ich will nicht mehr die Rassismus-Tante sein. I don't want to be the racist aunt anymore. And then somebody, two or three other people also mentioned the expression racism fatigue. Can you talk about this from your perspective, how you see this issue?
Yeah, actually, I just thought about that yesterday.
Yeah.
I thought, for some reason, I was getting out of bed. I thought, I'm tired of being the professional Asian American.
Yeah.
That I make my living off of just talking about being Asian American, and writing about being Asian American, thinking about being Asian American. And being Asian American isn't all that I am, right? I have other aspects of my life. And plus, when we talk about being Asian American in society, it's also oftentimes the problem about being Asian American. And so I'm always talking about, especially in the media, oh, another hate incident occurred. Oh, Asians are being blamed for this. And so it's always bad news that I have to talk about. I always have to talk about inequality and oppression. And that's sort of like depressing to see. For centuries, we have the same issue, and we're trapped in it, and complicit in it as well. That even though we say, oh yeah, we're victims of discrimination, Asians are also perpetuators of it, right? So that's tiring, and that's the notion of racism fatigue, is that, you hear it all the time. It gets sort of tiresome, and people play the race card, where they're saying, oh, my misfortunes are blamed on my race. And so I think it's a real thing, especially for people of color, that it's an additional stress. So I also study mental health, and people of color have higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of depression, higher rates of trauma, because we're people of color who experience inequality. And that actually impacts our well-being, that impacts our physical bodies. And so we carry on this racial fatigue throughout our lives. So one other example is, like, maybe you're at a restaurant, and the waiters take a long time to serve you. And you don't know why they're taking so long, but you can't help but think, they served the other people first. Why didn't they serve me? And you think, oh, it's because of my race, right? That's an example of racial fatigue, where it's like, in any little interaction we have with other people, race plays a significant role. And I don't think white people walk around worrying about that. White people don't walk into a room and worry, am I the only person in this room? Am I going to be treated differently? But for people of color, we walk into a room, and I notice who's in the room, right? I'm aware of the racial dynamics, the gender dynamics, who's older, who has power, and that's part of our consciousness, and it helps us in some ways. We need it to survive, but it's just tiring. So that's my sense of racial fatigue, is that it plays an outsized role in the lives of people of color. It shapes our consciousness. It becomes a stressor. But I think it also, this racial consciousness plays a protective factor. It's a needed factor, because if you don't have it, then you just get mistreated, and you sort of internalize that racism and blame yourself for what happens.
We've touched on the issue of consciousness a few times now, and I would suggest that it is also tied to language. So the next question I have is kind of goes back to a bit of basic semantics and yeah, the meaning of words. And it's there are really a plethora of expressions for people of color, and so there's people of color, BIPOC, AAPI, racialized people, Asian Americans, Black Afropeans, many expressions. And I wanted to just ask you, where do you see the importance of correct naming, of using language carefully?
Yeah, language makes a difference because it shapes, again, how we think about groups. We automatically think of groups as being different, and then we treat people differently. So we call that a racial schema. So people have ways of thinking, interpretive frameworks that help us with automatic thinking, automatic reactions. So if you see a dog barking at you, you don't stop to think that dog looks angry, that dog is barking. You automatically realize that's a threat, and you go into fight or flight mode. So having automatic thinking is behaviorally, evolutionarily advantageous. So you go into automatic reaction, fight or flight. People do the same thing when they see groups who are different, and you think, oh, is this person an enemy or and foe, or family and friend? And so that automatic thought is actually advantageous, because then you either run away from that enemy or you embrace that person.
Yeah.
But how we see people as enemy or friend is based, again, on our perception and our thinking, right? And race becomes one of the ways where we automatically think that person's dangerous, that person's a threat, that person is family. And one quick example is that we make these distinctions that lead to how we perceive things. Is after a flooding incident, they had a photograph in the news of white people, and they said people retrieving their belongings after the flood in the water, right? But for the Black people, they named it Black people looting, right? And they criminalized them. It's like, how do you know whether they're gathering their stuff or stealing the stuff? But that's the automatic perception that happens when people even just sort of label a photograph in the news. So racial schema shapes how we see people, and then how we automatically think about people. And our words help people develop automatic thoughts. So when people call COVID-19 Chinese virus, that shapes our schema. So we think, when we think about COVID, we think of it, oh, that's the Chinese disease. And the disease, which is simply biological, gets racialized. It becomes a Chinese disease. And that's an automatic thought that people have. When Trump uses that term over and over, when it goes in social media, people can't help but think that virus came from China. It's a Chinese disease. It not only racializes a virus, but that term, what we call it, stigmatizes a people. So Chinese are the disease carriers. So you hear Chinese virus, you think of Chinese people as being disease carrier. You see a Chinese person or someone who looks Chinese, and you think, uh-oh, COVID. It becomes people's automatic thinking, and that's how we were treated. So people weren't intentionally racist, but they were subconsciously racist because of the language. The terminology used by President Trump was stigmatizing and racializing, and that's how it's dangerous. That's what it's been documented through research. That correlation of the term Chinese virus led to anti-Asian hate. So what we call things really affects people's perceptions and then treatment of people, because we automatically act out of our perceptions. So calling us Asian Americans, for me, in the past, Asian Americans were called Orientals, and that conjured up stereotypes. Oh, Orientals are mysterious. Orientals are foreign. Orientals are dangerous, right? That harkens back to a Fu Manchu evil genius kind of perception. But Asian American was a whole new term that says we're both Asian and American. We belong to both. And so for me, shifting from being an Oriental to thinking of myself. So when I thought of myself as Oriental, then I thought, oh yeah, I don't belong here. I'm sort of abnormal. My family's sort of weird in the way we do customs. But when I thought of myself as being Asian American, it was a new term. And for me, it was really liberatory and freeing, because who knows what Asian Americans are, you know? Who knows what values Asian Americans have? To be Asian Americans could be you could be a person of justice. To be Asian American means you have solidarity with African Americans. To be Asian American means I could fill in the blank. And that's why I liked it. It was when I was growing up, it was a new term, and I go, I'm Asian American. I could be whatever I want to be. So it freed me the constraints of stereotypic images that others had of me and that I had of myself.
Thank you for this crystal clear elaboration of this connection between language and discrimination. And I don't have it among my questions, but I can't help asking, since it came up now very briefly. Could you just very briefly touch on the status of Asian American and African American synergies, collaboration? How do you see this?
Yeah. Historically, again, I think whiteness, or the idea of being a white person, gaining white privilege, and then gaining white supremacy, was always developed this whiteness in contrast to blackness, right? And so whites saw themselves as superior, blacks inferior. Whites then can own land and treat blacks as property. So you have this white-black binary, a white-black system, especially in the United States. And then Asians come along and, we're not white nor black, we're yellow. And so, like, where do we fit in the system? And white people saw us clearly not as white people, so we were treated like black people initially in the United States. We weren't allowed to testify in courts. We weren't allowed to own land. We weren't allowed to intermarry. So historically, Asians and blacks were treated similarly by law because we were not white.
Yeah.
But then over time, during Reconstruction in the United States, when blacks became free and whites needed more labor, the question is, should we bring in Chinese people to now be our cheap labor instead of blacks who are unfree labor? And so that led to the Chinese questions: should we bring in more Chinese? And so people pitted Chinese versus blacks, right, in order to get cheaper labor. And that pitting of Asians from blacks led to different treatment. So they saw Asians as invading. They saw Asians, whereas now blacks were free, they saw Asians were coolies, right? They're unfree labor. So we shouldn't bring them in because blacks are free, Asians are coolies. Blacks became Christian, Chinese are still pagan. And so people distinguish between blacks and Chinese, and that differential treatment. We were made aliens, ineligible for citizenship. Black could become citizens. So we became the new pagan, unfree, uncivilized pagan people. And so we were differentiated. And so that led to Asian, Black. Instead of being equally treated, we were treated differently. And so that differential treatment by government policies led to a severing of how groups were treated. And so then we had different histories based on how we were racialized. And that led to, even though we oftentimes lived in, when we're in contact with each other and live in similar neighborhoods, and there's a lot of solidarity that develops. But over time, if we live in different neighborhoods, then we hold stereotypes for each other, and we have more conflict. So, but I think, we are now, because of our differential treatment and differential histories, we're treated differently and racialized differently, and therefore have different interests. I think, so whereas in the white-black binary, whites are on top and blacks are on inferior, we have a different racial binary where Asians are seen as foreigners and whites were seen as, and blacks were seen as belonging insiders. So the insider-outsider binary, Asians seen as outsiders, leads to racialization of being treated as the yellow peril or as Islamophobic, Muslim terrorists. And that leads us to a form of discrimination. We're excluded, whereas blacks form a different racialization and face a different treatment. So we're racialized differently, I think, and then therefore treated differently. We're also seen as the model minority, Asian Americans, and that leads to a certain kind of treatment as well.
Okay. So yeah, it's a very different dynamic. We come to this penultimate segment, and it's intended to be a bit more light-hearted, but I've come to realize now in the course of the last 12 interviews that it tends to be a bit more challenging. I call it non-trigger trigger. It's trigger in the sense of that it should get a few thoughts and ideas started, like it's like this germination point for ad-libbing and improvising, but of course non-trigger, because it shouldn't be like in any way traumatic or triggering in the modern sense. So yeah, non-trigger trigger. And I say these words or expressions, and then you can just very briefly, it can be one word, it can be one sentence, what pops into your mind.
Okay.
Okay. The year 2020.
Pandemic, traumatizing.
Chinatown, San Francisco.
Home. It's good food, but it gave me headaches growing up because I think there was too much MSG, and that gave me headaches, which I associated with Chinatown, so I had a negative view of Chinatown.
Yeah. Asian American studies.
Liberatory, helping people free their consciousness, and then take action.
Model minority.
Just a overused stereotype that I think Asian academics talk about too much and should focus on the yellow peril.
Okay. Racial justice.
The pursuit of a better society where people assume responsibility and care for one another.
Everything, everywhere, all at once.
Michelle Yeoh's crowning achievement, weird humor with rocks talking.
Blocking.
My notion of how we should respond to adversity and trauma, rather than going into fight or flight mode, we come together and flock in strength in community.
Presidential election 2024.
re-traumatization of 2020's pandemic and resurrection of racist, xenophobic policies.
Finally, black, brown, yellow, white.
Solidarity, where we recognize each other's differences, find joy and power and insight from those differences, but also recognize that those differences are all part of our human experience and unity.
Thank you very much. You you really you did amazingly, because most people, almost everybody was really hard put by these words, but I think this is really very nice how you captured these different terms. In the last part, I am interested about some of your recommendations and outlooks, and I would start with some book recommendations you can give to the viewers.
I like, for history, this book by Catherine Sinisa Choi called Asian American Histories of the United States. And it's a great book because it starts with the present and looks at different issues in the present, but then traces back to understand why we have anti-Asian hate or why we have refugees in the United States. So I think it's an accessible book that actually gives people voice rather than an outsider's perspective. So it's Catherine Sinisa Choi's Histories of or Asian American Histories. I think, let's see what other books do I like. I like the author Celeste Ng, and so she's a novelist who I think her stories are compelling and very human, yet deal with complex issues of race and dystopia, suburbia in really compelling.
Yeah, is
ways.
she the writer of Little Fires Everywhere?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So she's now my favorite Asian American author. Yeah, so those are the first two that come off the top of my head.
Any movies or series you would recommend?
First thing I can think of is Shang-Chi, but just because it shows Asians being superheroes, but and it's pretty funny, and because it a lot of the location was in San Francisco, the neighborhood where I grew up, so I liked that. But yeah, I'll think about that and I'll get back to you if one pops in my head. Oh, I like I think it was it's a comedy, romantic comedy called Always Be My Maybe with Ali Wong. And the reason why I like it's funny, but it's set in the same neighborhood where I grew up. So I go, oh wow, these are people who grew up in the exact same houses. And I sort of like it. For me, it's because one character becomes famous and powerful and the other just wants to be normal and stay at home, and they have to decide, do I lead a more career advancing, prestigious, powerful life, or do I just sort of stay content where I am and learn to be content? And I have that same sort of tension where it's like, do I seek to become this, more acclaimed, accomplished person, or do I just like doing my normal stupid stuff every day and just sit around and watch TV? And so it's like I have those two tensions too.
Yeah, I love Ali Wong. She's very in your face and blunt, but incredibly um, to the point, and she really teases out the different strands of social antagonisms. Are there some open projects, or what are your open projects? Yeah.
Yes, I'm writing now, and some of the themes I'm talking about are because we went through a period of collective racial trauma, I'm looking at how Asians have responded in terms of their mental health with that flocking mechanism of how we all people experience trauma, but how we handle adversity differs. And I think how Asians have responded to racism and trauma through this flocking response and gaining social support, but in other ways have been really powerful. So we're not only victims of hate, but we're resilient in our Asian heritage. So I'm writing about that, the mental health, but I'm also writing about part of that resilience and flocking mechanism leads to collective action. And so Stop AAPI Hate was a big movement. And so I'm looking at, Asians were seen as this quiet model minority who just worked hard. But my view of history is I saw Chinese and Asians always fighting back collectively against racism. And so I'm writing about collective action in Asian American history. So the very first railroad workers went on strike. And at the same time, they all laid down their tools over 30 miles of track. When you think about it, how did they communicate? How did they know when to stop? How did they agree to fight their boss? Because they spoke different languages. They couldn't communicate electronically. So how did they organize so well? Asians engaged in the largest case of civil disobedience after the Exclusion Act. So I go, how did they do that? How did they get 90% of the community across the nation to risk deportation? But they did. So I'm writing about movements of justice within the Asian American community. I think it's not only helpful for Asians to learn how we deal with racism and how we take action against it, but I think it's helpful for all of our different societies. Again, if we realize that diversity is a strength, then what can we learn from Asian Americans to contribute to society overall? How can society overall deal with trauma? How can society overall work collectively for justice?
Excellent. When do you think we can be looking forward?
I don't know. I'm writing it now and hoping for publishers. So yeah, if you know of anybody who wants to buy my book, then let me know.
Okay. And finally, the last one is a bit maybe a bit more personal, but what are maybe 1 or 2 or 3 practices in your life, everyday practices, every week practices, whatever the case may be, that you have seen to yield some positive results?
Well, I journal every day, and it's like a form of prayer for me. It's a form of gratitude. So I think gratitude is really, really important because, again, we could feel hopeless, we could feel complaining, we could become cynical, but gratitude enables you to recognize that, I'm blessed. I'm part of something bigger than myself, that I have God watching over me and caring for me. So that journaling, it's also journaling beyond expressing gratitude is a way for you to externalize your anxieties and fears, and just by getting it out helps you start problem solving and taking control of your life and feeling empowered. So journaling, I think, is for me are really useful. So I write every day. And then I run a lot. So I go out running every day. And for me, I often run out. Here we have redwood forests. Here we have the San Francisco Bay. So I'm either running in trees or by water. And so connecting with nature in that way, I think just, again, gives me a sense of being embodied in nature and being free, just running. So for me, journaling is an inward movement and running is an outer expression of life.
Okay, thank you very much. This is already the end of all these questions.
Yeah, so this is, I talked a long time. Sorry for talking so
No,
long.
no, no, no. It was really very, very interesting to listen to. Um, and also the your analysis and approach to these issues of discrimination and the experiences you've made being a part of community activism, I think it's extremely insightful and also to be quite frank, inspiring, because personally all I do is these little few interviews, but to hear you and the activities you've been doing, it's really yeah, inspiring.
Okay. Well, thanks for you asked great questions. It gave me a lot of food for thought. So thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, and all the best with your book also, with your research. And
Okay. Well, thanks a lot.
okay,
I look
thank
forward to seeing
you.
it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Russell.
Okay. Have a good time taking care of your kids.
Take care. All the best.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.